Good afternoon or good morning to folks, whether you're here central or east, or then morning for the folks a little bit more west. We're going to wait just a few minutes. In the past, we've had quite a few attendees for this, probably closer to 50. So I'm going to wait just a couple minutes before we get started. But I am guessing this is probably going to be a smaller group.
At 12? Oh my God. Look at all these. Could you?
All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I see some folks are slowly trickling in. As anticipated, this would be a smaller group, just given the time of the year, and I know how busy everyone is, and there's lots of personal and collective ambivalence around yet another Zoom meeting. So I greatly appreciate folks' interest for participating in this Ask the Editor session. Before we get started, there were Lindsay, who is the editorial assistant, can you remind me just how many others of these we've done and maybe give some information about where they've been posted?
Yeah, this is the third or fourth Ask the Editor that we've had, and JCD has a YouTube channel now. So if you just Google like JCD YouTube, you should be able to find it, or you can reach out to me at jcd@unt.edu and I can send you the link and you can watch the prior videos. They've been between an hour to 2 hours. There's been a lot of questions just about like how to publish in JCD, expectations around that, and then things that we were doing. So you have access to that if you want. So feel free to reach out or Google it.
Yeah, one of the nice things about these is the kind of spontaneous questions that are kind of unique to each session. I mean, I realize it's a lot of content, and some of which might be relevant and others might be redundant or not necessarily tailored to your particular interest, but still nonetheless, it's out there and available. And yeah, so with that in mind, the basic nature of this, well, I guess first I'll introduce myself. My name is Matthew Limburger Truelove. I'm the current editor of the Journal of Counseling and Development. This is finishing my third year as editor, and anticipate hopefully a second term leading into the next, I guess it would be 4 years. The nature of these Ask the Editors is really to be helpful to authors, and it's really driven by the questions and inquiries that you all have. You know, the primary hope is that whatever information that we can provide you will lead to submissions that are more fit for the scope and possibly help the quality so that it amplifies the probability of publication in the journal, even though it certainly doesn't guarantee that. Also gives us information to hear from folks out there who've been reading the journal, maybe some of the things that would be helpful for us in the review process, or maybe some of the things that folks as readers have liked or would like to see more of. But with that being said, really the rest of our time here today should be driven by the questions that you all have, hence the title. So feel free to ask them in free form verbally, or if you want to put them in the chat, With this small of a group, I should be able to handle it myself, but I've got Lindsay here, my editorial assistant, who can help facilitate a little bit of that to make certain I stay on task. So welcome, and please feel free to start asking questions.
Yes, I can start, and I will keep my camera on so y'all don't feel lonely. My name is Helen Lupton Smith, and I was at NC State in the counselor education program there, and I just recently switched from a non-tenure professional track clinical role to a tenure track role at North Carolina Central. And so I'm diving back into writing and researching more. And could you just talk a little bit about philosophically and currently what JCD is looking for and hoping for with, publications and contributions?
Yeah, no, that's a perfect first question. So, well, first of all, welcome and congratulations on your new appointment.
Thank you.
Yeah, with JCD philosophically, and it should be apparent, but it was definitely a surprise to me, the numbers of submissions that only marginally pertain to counseling and that get submitted. And I think that part of that ambiguity is that as counselors, we kind of have a generalist role in that, we have to be semi-learned in a great variety of different areas because we have a great diversity of clients and the things that affect their lives. But with JCD, we're predominantly interested in pieces that really describe the process and outcome of counseling practice. And so to elucidate a little bit more about how this can be confusing, like in psychology, there are psychological or even sociological phenomenon that we can describe cross-sectionally. Like I'm feeling anxiety today, right? Because I'm having this meeting and then 2 hours later have another very large meeting with JCD. And anxiety is something that certainly is germane to the lived experiences of many clients. And yet, if it's not studied in a counseling context, how appropriate is it for us to induce inferences for counseling? And we get many submissions, I mean, truly a great number of submissions where the link to counseling is an overinterpretation of their findings. And so philosophically, I've worked very hard to really kind of right that ship, to really focus on maybe to a fault. Like if there's a piece that is not giving feedback to authors, because I try to be helpful, even if pieces really don't fit within our scope. But then especially with authors whose pieces are patently tied to counseling processes or outcomes, helping them be successful in the publication process. I don't know if that fully answers your question. I mean, there's certainly other things that probably will come to mind as I go forth, but it at first blush, that is definitely the kind of centering philosophic axiom that I consider is like, really, can this inform practice and or what we look for to outcomes? Now, adjunctive to that is that there are lots of things that are, because I don't want it to make it sound like cross-sectional or descriptive work cannot be made pertinent to counseling. I mean, that is not the case, especially with our assessment section. But again, even with assessment, and it's assessment and diagnoses, even with assessment and diagnoses, you have to tread kind of gingerly that you're not overstepping your design or the results that you have. As I was talking, there was one other thing that came to mind, but it is going in and out. Maybe I could speak really generally to our review process also that might help here. So when a submission lands through Scholar One, which is our interface that we use, it then goes to one of the two editorial assistants, Lindsay, who's here, who's helped facilitating this, and then another Tessa. Either one of those will be helping out, and then it gets assigned an associate editor who is methodologically, we try to connect the design of the study, or if it's a theoretical piece, we have some AE associate editors who are experts in conceptual and theoretical pieces. And then it's assigned, we do the best that we can to try to find reviewers who are on the review board whose content area is consistent with the submission. So what we have then is we have methodological experts at the AE level and review experts. And sometimes, you can have both, people who AEs who are content experts who also have acumen in that research design, but then also the same is true with reviewers. And what we've tried to do is create an ethos of helpfulness. I mean, so often you have some pretty precarious, if you've ever submitted to a journal before, some pretty precarious reviews. And I mean, we certainly get that, but again, just trying to create a culture of helpfulness, like not just being kind of Pollyannish, but like operationally, if there's something in this manuscript that is needs reconsideration, rather than just simply calling out and diminishing the work of the author, how can this be reconsidered in a way? Because the supposition at JCD is that with a less than 10% acceptance rate most years, and given it's a flagship journal in our profession, that the greater majority of things will get rejected, but that doesn't mean that they will get rejected to the next journal. Like, I want authors to submit because they'll get good feedback in addition to the prospect of getting published in the top journal. And I want that experience to be good too. So it'll go to the two reviewers, and then the two reviewers' feedback will go to the associate editor, who will also offer comment based upon their own read, but then also with consideration of the two reviewers. And then I always do a thorough review myself, which some editors do and some do not, but I find it important. If the only times where I am a little bit more diminutive in my comments is when I really just don't have anything added. Like, I don't want to waste an author's time. Like, I don't want them to have to read the same thing. And so in those cases, if I think the AE and reviewers have covered everything certainly better than I could, then I might point to one or two things that led to the decision, so the authors kind of have some indication of the decision point. So in sum, the two kind of philosophic positions that drive JCD are: one, is it tied to counseling? And then two, can this be something that we help out, whether it's going to be published in JCD or one of the other almost 19, I think, counseling journals in ACA. I think it's 19. It might be more now.
Well, I just want to say thank you, and I'll let others talk. I think it's helpful knowing that it can be theoretical and research, and it sounds from a practical perspective. So you're looking for practical pieces, and maybe not as much counselor educator, but counselor practitioner pieces. I wasn't sure about that. And I also want to say thank you for being so helpful in the review process, because JCD is probably the most intimidating one that we could all apply for. So appreciate that the process is a learning process. So
well,
thank you.
Yeah, you bring up something that is another kind of like delicate rope to dance on, and that is, our counselor education piece is pertinent. And I don't want to say no. I know it's almost a double negative there, but the preference is practice pieces, right? And so if they are counselor education pieces, the ones that do make it through, and the reason why we do this, and this is, I adopted this from my predecessor as well. I mean, we just don't want JCD to be counselor ed and supervision light. It's part of it's kind of quoting from Rick Bolkin. And the other of which is that the preponderance of our readers look to JCD as practitioners. And then thirdly, just to respect the kind of turf or the specialty of counselor ed and supervision, like that's what that journal's for. Now, there are pieces that do have implications for counseling that are counselor education pieces. So like, for example, if you studied the growth of counselor education students in their practicum experience with clients, and in some ways that those findings have implications for practice, because even though there are some nuances to a clinical university setting, there's still something that inferentially can improve practice outside of that site specific area. So I'm not, and then secondly, I mean, there occasionally are some counselor ed and or supervision pieces that really are kind of profession, I don't want to say altering. I mean, it's pretty rare, but there are occasions, but that have such a major contribution that it just makes sense that the flagship journal with the largest readership has those. And that's, I mean, I'm also a little cautious to say it's just a quality thing, because that just has this kind of erroneous assumption that like they're just better. That's not the case. It's really that they have a broader reach, right? There's a kind of qualitative aspect to them that they affect our constituent readers just differently, and that's kind of what we look for. Looks like I have one in the chat. I'm going to read it to myself so I don't. Will you talk about how you're making sure voices of minoritized groups and research being done? Yeah, around. So that's a great question. So the first question, I mean, I think part of this is just being attentive to the review board themselves, that they have not only composed of a diverse intersection of reviewers that therefore is reflective of our larger readers, but then also the needs of clients. But then again, kind of like what I said before, is creating a culture of this, within the review board, that every article it shouldn't just be a tack on. I mean, I'm going to use the parallel like in a counseling theories master's textbook, where almost ubiquitously at the end of every chapter is, well, here's the relevance to culture. And whereas I think that's great, because what it does is it challenges even classical theories to be considered in a cultural way. It does make it feel like a tack on. Whereas with JCD, I want it to be more than that. Like, we have meetings parallel to the Ask the Editors with our review board, and one of the constant conversations is the centering nature of culture and social justice. Not that I would encourage anyone to read any of my scholarship, but I mean, that's certainly the case in my own work, and I hope that it gets transmitted down. So I think those two answers are the two primary things, and that one, having the right people in our review board who represent the great diversity of our various constituents, whether they be clients, counselors, counselor educators, so on and so forth. And then secondly, just again, kind of creating that ethos of value and culture. All right, let me see your second question here. How's the editorial staff generally working mix in there? Yeah, so I mean, I can't speak for ACA, but I mean, that certainly was a consideration relative to JCD in the application process, is that just our focus on including diverse voices. Like, it's kind of a little trepidatious to answer that, just because, again, I don't necessarily represent ACA, even though ACA does the appointment, but so I don't know. I know that their decision process went through multiple different levels of application, first starting with a publication committee and then moving to the governing council. But and I know that that is one of the criteria, is including diverse voices for positions of leadership. All right. So a second question. I'm sorry, folks. The pause is me is getting through this. Research must not exceed 30 pages, including the references. Does that include the title page and abstract? No, not necessarily. And that's, And that's for the initial submission. I mean, we do have a little bit of wiggle room, and I'm a little cautious to say this now, but um, it is relevant because I don't want people to not submit. But within the next year, if I'm remembering this correctly, and Lindsay will correct me if I'm wrong, but ACA, with our partnership with Wiley, we're pivoting to a different copy editing process and the way that things are ultimately published. And so some of those guidelines will change. It wasn't arbitrary, the 30 pages in the past. It was based upon people say, well, now that we've moved completely to online, why do we still have these 30-page restrictions? Well, we still had to copy edit every piece, and that there's cost incurred in that, right? And typesetting and so on and so forth. So those arrangements with Wiley are changing, and so we aren't going to be as restricted to page limits into the future. And there's some other innovations that we're going to do, like supplemental materials that oftentimes consume lots of pages that are important but more pertinent as appendices. Like we'll be able to link into those into the future and not have to, they won't have to occupy manuscript pages. So this is a concern for folks who do qualitative research, certain types of quantitative research, especially some of the newfangled approaches, HLM, single subject designs. Like 30 pages is just hard to get it all in. So a lot of that will change in the near future. But to the immediate question, yeah, title and abstract does not count. Probably for the next year, the 30 pages is something to pay attention to, but yeah, don't worry about those two aspects. What is my advice in reconciling the AP recommendations? Oh, sorry, for the use of citations for statements throughout a manuscript. Well, so we do have to maintain consistency with the APA guidelines, and if I'm understanding it correctly, the question, just that multiple citations of, for example, multiple citations in a similar paragraph, it can occupy space. I recognize that as a potential way of taking up some of that valuable space, but yeah, there's just something that we have to adhere to, as part of our guidelines. So I'm hoping I answered that question, and if not, then please move forward. And then Lindsay actually added something into the chat.
When we're doing the page count for Wiley, they do make us kind of add the abstract in there. So theoretically, it is kind of taken into account in the page limit a little bit when we're doing the numbering around that. Okay. But like you said, there's a little bit of flexibility. So
yeah, the one thing that there's not, and that we get a lot of these in submissions, is tables and figures. And we do have set numbers, and it's 3 and 2, and I always get, is it 3 tables and 2 figures, or 2 figures and 3 tables? I
think it's 3 tables and 2 figures.
Yeah. No, and then Lindsay put up the date that will make the switch to the page link, so it's not that far to the distant future.
There was a question from someone who left, but I still think it's a really relevant question, just around counseling policy and advocacy for our profession, and just kind of speaking to that a little bit.
Let's see here. Yeah, I mean, the way I interpret the question or statement is how things are used. I mean, well, so yes, there is a desire to publish pieces that can help advocate for the profession. I can think of a couple in the recent past that, one, for example, that talked about changes in like insurance and how counselors respond to that. And so that those types of pieces are certainly desired. The trick here is that you want to have a strong thesis and you want to make a compelling thesis whereby you're presenting a case, but there's a fine line between an effective thought piece that's trying to pursue a thesis versus an opinion piece around policy. And that, you know, it, because policy is so perspectival, you know, that's the one thing I would just encourage folks, if you want to write a piece that's a comment piece on policy, that it still has to be academic in some ways, and that you're really trying to create a case rather than you know, just proffer an opinion.
If there's not a lot of other questions, did you want to speak a little bit about the centennial issue? I know we kind of put that on the docket for today, or was that, I don't know, just thinking about it.
Yeah, no. So we are approaching, and as maybe folks are trying to formulate some questions or some thoughts, yeah, we are approaching a the 100th issue. I'm sorry, volume for JCD, which it's kind of a little nebulous. I mean, the profession, because of it, you know, for folks, I'm guessing that everyone here is probably pretty familiar with this, coming out of educational guidance and vocational guidance, is there a fixed point, you know, when it transitioned from the various different associations into what is now the American Counseling Association, but still nonetheless, the past versions of the journal that had different names, where we now are, is up to that 100th volume. So there's some excitement there, and, you know, certainly encourage people to submit. Some other exciting things that's happened in the past: we just published the special issue for folks who are, especially students or junior faculty, who are looking for guidance around methodology. We just had the most recent issue was a special issue related to different empirical designs, especially empirical designs that are becoming more and more utilized by counseling scholars, and those that have some promise that maybe haven't been utilized as much, but have got some kind of nascent possibilities. Like, you know, I think particularly on the quantitative side, different nested models like HLM and single subject designs, things that are really, you know, that have been around in other disciplines for a while, but these pieces have offered good insights into how you do these within counseling pieces. So the question is JCD stance on pieces outside of the United States? Awesome. And, yeah, we need more of them. You know, it actually is something that does, I mean, we don't privilege pieces, whether they're domestic or outside of the continental United States, and yet there is some value for associated with it, in that certain metrics, like Thompson's, like look at impact factor, like to be included in certain depositories. Like they do look at just the international reach of your publication, like who's citing, who's on the review board. So there is some extrinsic value, but just intrinsically, you know, it goes to what I was suggesting before, where it adds diverse voices. I mean, I think the one point of clarification, though, is that it still nonetheless has to be framed in a way that's pertinent to our typical readership, you know. So if we're talking, because counseling is just construed different ways in different places, and so if it's consistent with the definition of counseling that's associated with the American Counseling Association, that's really grounded in wellness prevention, in development, and there's probably, you know, that's Meyer's 1992 piece. I think, you know, we could also say social justice now. It's probably a fourth pillar, then it'll fit.
Turkey's actually a country we get submissions from quite a bit,
Yeah.
which is great.
Well, Helen, please take the microphone. It's like in class where, you know, if you have a question, someone else might have that question and is either a little too shy or they didn't realize they had that question until someone asked it. So.
Yeah, that's if you had any tips or things that if you were either telling people right out of their doctoral program or you know, those of us returning to a more focused role on research and writing, any tips or advice that you would say?
Yeah. So I mean, and I'll try to go up and down the line of different types of submissions. And I've kind of alluded to some of these things before, but some of the things I would suggest, like if I had a editor's top 10 suggestions, I'll start with conceptual, theoretical pieces. When I was responding to the policy question before, I mean, having a clear thesis statement and that's again differentiating the thesis statement between an opinion statement. I think we see that a lot as well. And then substantiating that. In some ways, you almost have to think of a theoretical piece as kind of analogous to an empirical piece, where every different aspect of your manuscript in some way you should be able to like draw lines back to the thesis and say this is why this is necessary, right? This is what builds the case. I'm actually going to toss in here like some things about empirical pieces. Like with empirical pieces, one of the things that I most consistently see, and I think this is just because of the ways things are taught or just not taught in our doctoral programs around how to frame a manuscript, is when you're writing a dissertation or in your graduate program when you're taught to do a study, to build up the expert capacity of knowledge, you kind of throw the kitchen sink at the article, right, or at what you're writing, and you're told everything that's pertinent, just cite it, right? And that can be a bit clumsy, or at least not elegant, in a 30-page manuscript. While it's helpful information and you should be informed about those things and you should have considered all of those things, really the purpose of a literature review, for example, is you're substantiating why there's multiple. You're substantiating why the study is performed, but you're also trying to inform the readers why you made the empirical choices you've made, like why this design. And so again, looking at a quantitative piece, and with qualitative, I'll come back around because I think you do the same thing in just a backwards type of way. It's not that it's backwards itself, but you have to think differently. You have to think it's just a very different paradigm. But like if I have 5 or 6 different constructs that I've measured, you have to in some ways substantiate in your buildup and your framing of the article things about those constructs. And so what we oftentimes see is that people will talk very broad strokes around the topic and give lots of topic content background, but not really offer the reader much specific context related to what things they're studying, what things they're measuring in that broader context. And so you have to almost go back and filter the two. You have to think, okay, what does my reader need to know about this broader topic specific to what is being studied in this particular study? And again, with quantitative pieces, you make those decisions a priori. Remove that word before, it's not backwards, but with qualitative, oftentimes it's not a priori, right? You're waiting and see as those themes emerge. Well, then as they emerge and you're describing them in your results, you need to ensure that in your literature review that your audience understands those concepts that are later going to be a part of your results. And then the other thing is that if they were important enough to discuss in the literature, and if you have results on them in the discussion section, and this is probably my biggest suggestion for folks, like the discussion sections that we oftentimes get are really interesting stories sometimes, but they have nothing to do with the study itself. And again, this is a kind of filtering that I was referring to before, but rather than filtering it as a how you frame it, this is how you make it related to counseling process and outcome. Is that if I discuss this in my literature review, if I have results, how do I synthesize these? And I do really mean that in the kind of classic philosophic way that Hegel talked about a synthesis. If your literature review is like the thesis and your results is like the antithesis, that compare and contrast. And antithesis doesn't mean opposite or different. It just means how does this set ideas from what we knew before in some ways juxtapose or get informed by as a generative relative to these new results. And that really should constitute your discussion section. But we don't see that a lot. Like I really see a lot of discussion sections that are almost completely divorced from other portions of the manuscript. And so there should be like this continuity between, again, how you substantiate the purpose of your study, to the literature that you choose, to the choice of design, including the instrumentation or qualitative questions or processes, to your discussion section. And akin to what I said earlier about a theory piece with a thesis statement, you should be able to do a similar thing with your empirical pieces, where you can almost draw lines back and forth and say, well, here's how these ideas are connected. Like, there's some continuity across these various sections. And I think that that's not just for JCD. I mean, that's just effective academic writing. And once you get that kind of scheme down, it's actually academic writing. I don't want to say it's easy, but it becomes very elegant, right? Because you've got the kind of mental template.
Thank you. That's helpful. Thanks.
Do you have any other questions or comments or things that you think might be helpful for us as well to think about?
I have a question. So in terms of the population that you've seen in these studies, what population is people are, I would say, is like the less focused on? Are people mostly looking at counseling students, counselors, clients? What have you missed?
Yeah, I mean, so we definitely get all of the above, and I would say probably with some equity of distribution. I mean, as I don't know if you heard this at the outset, but I think the preference, I mean, I don't want to say preference, but really to fit within the scope, if it's really counseling students, if it really more pertains to counselor education, there are some pieces that have some broader application and relevance to the field, and so they will be things that are valued and potentially publishable. But as a profession, so there's a piece done, I think, in 2010, so some of this research needs to be updated, but looking at all of the 19 divisions within ACA, including the JCD, so as the broader flagship that encompasses those divisions, all the journals associated with them, it was 6% of our literature is some type of intervention piece, and most of which are not well constructed, like controlled studies, many of which were one-day interventions or non-randomized groups, and there's some value in those pieces, and I don't think you have to. In fact, there's many limitations to the so-called gold standard of a clinical study, like how relevant, how oftentimes are the rigors of a clinical study something that gets transmogrified out into the environment. Like, most clinicians don't get to practice under those type parameters. And yet still, nonetheless, we are a practice profession. If the paucity of our research is actually practice and outcome pieces, what are we teaching when that goes back to counselor education? What are we practicing based upon? So with JCD, like, there is definitely a value that I hold, that if we're describing in a well done study the experiences or outcomes of counseling practice, those pieces will be valued. And so, but on the flip side of that, if we have such a diminutive numbers of studies published like that, and it's gone up, I'm guessing, since 2010, but that probably is indicative that we're getting fewer submissions like that. We're really getting a lot of studies about ourselves, which, again, there's a place for that, but it shouldn't constitute 90% of our literature or more.
Okay. And we're trying to figure out the need. We're looking at JCD. That's all I would ask that question.
Yeah. And again, I mean, I have strong opinions about it. So this is me as the current editor, but I don't think that my opinion is too terribly controversial. Like, as a need, I mean, we need more process and outcome pieces. We need more process and outcome pieces across diverse samples. And by diverse, I don't just mean whittling it down to a couple of demographic points, but that's certainly important too. But really, like, diversity of settings, diversity of gender, ability, socioeconomic groups, developmental, like, we need replication of those studies. Like, we have to think very broadly about including the greatest number of voices in actual counseling process and outcome scholarship. And I get all the reasons why that type of work is hard. It really is hard for a variety of reasons. And if folks are interested, I certainly can talk about some of those challenges. And yet, even if our literature were 50% intervention pieces, it still would need more, and we're nowhere near 50%.
Thank you.
I think I'm seeing a question here. Is there a way to get feedback around a topic prior to submission? Okay, so kind of like I try not to do this for a number of reasons, and the most important is like equity, right? Part of it's time, but I mean, I'm deeply committed to working. Like, I see Lindsay smiling. She knows my work ethic is a little probably counterproductive to my personal health at times, but so I'm willing to do it, but I'm also not willing to do it if it creates inequity between authors. And a pre-review does create inequity in that it privileges a piece that maybe didn't fit and someone just didn't think to ask. And so I'm not willing to kind of compromise on doing pre-reviews. I think that we do pretty good job of, like, if you think it's maybe relevant and maybe not, the desk reject process, which desk reject, if you're not familiar with that, is that as I described earlier, the first level is it goes through the editorial assistants who make comments on fitness and does it fit within the guidelines. I mean, that always comes within 10 days and generally within less than that. sometimes a day or two, sometimes hours. So it never hurts to submit. And if it just doesn't fit within the scope, you'll know quick enough to submit somewhere else. Lindsay, am I pretty accurate about never more than 10 days? Like I can't even think of one. I mean, even during my
Yeah,
day job.
it's very quick. Sometimes they disappear in there before I even get to them. And then I'm
Yeah.
hunting around like, where was that one?
Yeah.
I think you could probably say just a little bit more on that too, is like the main thing we're really looking for when we're deciding on scope is like how developed are the implications for counseling, and then like does the methodology fit the study? And in a
That's
lot
right.
of ways, that's really what we're kind of doing our initial screening on. And so if you take that into account when you submit, that's helpful.
That's right. And I'm going to frame this in kind of a coarse way intentionally, but I'll kind of massage it down. Like even a poorly constructed study within some reason, like if it's just littered with, if it's unreadable, I'm not going to, have the review board members occupy their very precious time doing that. But even if it's kind of a dubious study that fits within the scope, like I think that we owe a service to authors to, again, be helpful. So it'll go through. What gets a desk reject is probably in this order of magnitude, like if it's not relevant to counseling, and sometimes it's just deeply apparent, like we've had some engineering pieces or some nursing pieces, right? But even if a person kind of litters it with the word counselor throughout, but it really is a psychological study where it's just, in not psychological like psychology, like clinical or counseling psychology. Those are perfectly fine. Cross-disciplinary is a great form of diversity. But by psychology, I mean like the, first person perspective of what's going on, as describing like developmental psychology or social psychology. Like those types of pieces just don't fit because, again, can they inform what a counselor does? Possibly, but we don't really know that. It would take a leap and it would take an interpretation. And so what you have is you'll have people who will perform a study, and then because you're required to talk about implications for practice in your discussion section as a part of our guidelines and just required composition of a manuscript, they'll take results and they'll say, well, I'm trying to think of a decent example here. I'll make something up, but well, okay, the one I used earlier about like just normal anxiety, like day-to-day anxiety. And, then you can take some literature and say, well, mindfulness is a great approach for ameliorating just normal anxiety. And so then in their discussion section, because they studied just typical anxiety and now they've found some literature about outcome pieces related to this, they're making recommendations for mindfulness practice with their population. They didn't study mindfulness with that population. So it might have been true that this is helpful, but they have no evidence of it and they're making a statement. And so what happens is there's a philosophic idea of reification. Now someone else can go behind them and say, well, in this published article, they said that this approach is pertinent to this population. But it's not. We literally have no evidence for it. But those types of conjectural jumps have been proffered. And so things like that just aren't within the scope. And so, those generally get desk rejected. Yeah. And then other things like the APA formatting, length, like we'll get some 50-page things, which again, hopefully into the future is not going to be as big of a deal. But yeah, other things like that just basically, things not fitting in with the author guidelines are not really within the scope of counseling. Any advice for junior faculty and doctoral students who want to publish with JCD? We try to offer things that I haven't kind of already said before. I mean, again, well, maybe no. I'm going to repeat this because I think it's worth repeating. And, what we do know from learning psychology is that things have to be stated, 4 to 7 times within like a 2-hour period. Perform intervention research, like a well-designed intervention study. And, especially with client populations who are not oftentimes represented in the literature. If you have access to anything that makes it closer to the gold standards, every check mark related to intervention research that you can do, like, if you can have randomization, it's going to be even better. If you can have control groups, it's not necessary, but a lot of designs, that's pretty compelling. If you can have longitudinal data, and so I'm definitely very biased. Like, I think that there's, again, value, and there's lots of elegance in the old kind of basic regression and other types of ANOVA pre-post tests, and yet if you look at the philosophic axioms of counseling that I referred to earlier, based upon that Jane Myers piece from '92, it doesn't make sense. In fact, it's more like clinical psychology if we're just pre to post, because there's a inference that we're anesthetizing pathology, and that's not where counseling really comes from. We're more concerned with development over time. And so if you have longitudinal data that evinces client growth, that, at least in my eyes, is going to be not only more philosophically congruous with counseling, it's just a better study. Now, again, I get that they're hard to do for a variety of reasons: test retest bias, clients dropping out, whatever it may be, the sample size. But on the qualitative front, well-designed studies that described the process or lived experience of outcomes is going to be valued just as much as the quantitative pieces that I described before, that are longitudinal or have good randomized designs, and they have appropriate rigor. So yeah, anything that really shows the efficacy, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to work, right? Like, there's the publication bias of studies that show significance, but there's a great number of things that don't show significance that tell a good story and that are important. I think there's this idea that if this intervention didn't work, then you just won't get it published anywhere. And I think if you do a well-designed study, and you didn't see significant results, and you have a good way of taking those results and framing it in such a way that it can improve practice, submit those to JCD. I'm not going to look at things that work any more desirable than things that just didn't work out, because we just learn as much from both. If not, we learn more sometimes than the things that don't work. Some other suggestions: don't be deterred by rejections. What I oftentimes see with junior faculty is that, like, they'll submit once and then you just never see them anything again. Yet I know that just mathematically, to get tenure anywhere, you need to have, at a teaching institution, maybe as low as 5, and at research institutions, upwards of 15 to 30 things published before you go up for tenure, right? Or then become a full professor. If something didn't get accepted at a journal, like, that's not an indictment of you as a human being. It's just that one piece didn't fit at that time. And take the suggestions offered, and this is something that, like, is true for subsequent pieces, but then even that piece that was rejected, like, I think that sometimes we personalize it so much, and I've had a great number of rejections in my career, but when I get feedback, even if it's someone who is offering kind of that really kind of unkind and more opinionated response to my work, I will look at this as, rather than this is a critique, I'll look at it as, this is reflective of what other readers, like even if it's a wrong-headed, even if they didn't get it. So one of my first publications before my time as an editor in JCD was probably the editor at the time thought that it was the first, and I don't know if it was the first, but it probably was one of a handful of first times that an HLM, like longitudinal design with nested effects at multiple levels across time and within groups, have been published in a counseling journal. And the associate editors didn't know that analyses. The reviewers certainly didn't. And there was lots of really just inaccurate statements in the reviews. And yet the way that I interpreted that was their read of this as experts is going to be reflective of others. How can I, in some way, still maintain integrity to what is true of what was done and you know what is the accepted practice, but then also phrase this in such a way that maybe isn't over the heads or lost in others. And so, you know, that suggestion would, you know, can be again for a single piece, but then just in general, like I think so oftentimes people get intimidated by JCD, and it's just, I would submit to JCD invariably first, and it's just, you know, basically what I'm asking for is you all to make me work even more, because the lowest common denominator is you're going to get feedback, right? That hopefully will help you. And even if it's wrong, the feedback, because that will happen, and I try to mitigate that as much as is possible, myself and others, but that's impossible. It still is reflective of how people in our field are reading your work, and that can inform how you revise it so that it's more approachable to more people, which I think is really the point. So.
Another question's just come through the chat about whether the editorial board discusses ways to increase the journal's ranking scores.
Okay, so this type of question comes up all the time. And this is hard because, yes, the way that things get ranked, and depending upon which ranking system, there's some variance or at least differences. But just generally, it's numbers of citations relative to numbers of articles published. Now, the easiest way to do that is publish good pieces, timely pieces, right? But you can't really predict. You know, you can do like good Bayesian analysis here, and you know, based upon prior information, here's what we can anticipate in the future, and we do that currently. Like I don't try to let the tail wag the dog and simply say, well, let's accept this one because it's most likely to be cited, and yet I do not neglect that equation, right? I do think, okay, this is something that's going to be cited, so therefore it probably is something that's valued by a lot of people. There's other ways that are more artificial, that are gaming the system, and I've talked about this for years. And of those changes I mentioned before, we've been behind the 8 ball in some ways as counseling journals because of the way that our copy editing agreements were forged with our publisher, that was doing a disservice to us, not in the quality of our publications, but in how fast things came to in-press status that people could cite. So let me explain this a little bit more, because it's kind of a funky idea. So for Thompson, their impact factor, I think it's theirs, there's a 2-year window. So only things that count are within that, if it was cited 2 years from publication. Now, if you look at counseling journals, it usually takes anywhere from 6 months to a year for things to go into review. That 6 months to a year is one less year of that. It basically cuts the half-life. And so something that was published in 2020, for example, would have to be read and cited almost instantaneously for it to hit that impact factor. Now, the way that other journals and disciplines have gamed the system is they have what was called online first, where things were not published but they were in the official issue of a journal, but they were in a online, like you could, if you were a member of an association, or if you cited it, I mean, I'm sorry, searched it and you know, paid a fee, so you got that one article, or if people just cited from the abstract or whatever, however they got access to it, things were getting cited before they were officially published. And that wasn't a part of our agreements for many years. And that's changing. That's one of those things in January 2022 that's changing. We are going to start going to an online first, which will help advance or improve our impact factor. The final thing, and this is just something we can't do, we can't control. And even though we're lumped in with in those like Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4 groupings, we're not. It's not apples to apples. Like it's not just comparing counseling journals to counseling journals. It's comparing us to ed psych and counseling psych and so on and so forth. And because of the niche nature of our profession, like we don't get a lot of multidisciplinary. We do get some, but we don't get a lot of multidisciplinary citations, which is really what it takes to get high, to break those thresholds. And in addition to that, as I stated before, like with that short citation window, given that many of our counseling journals only have like 2 or 3 issues a year, the period by which our within discipline journals could cite even our flagship journal is just very unlikely. So in other words, let me take an example here of like the journal I used to edit prior to JCD, the Journal of Humanistic Counseling. It used to be every 2 issues a year, and during my tenure we moved it to 3. But so then when you do the math on a 2-year window, and it should be 6, but it's really for funky reasons the way that they set up the citation metrics, you lose one of those cycles. I can't remember if it's the January or the like end of the year, like the Decembers. And so it'd really be 5 issues that counted, which is different than like let's think of one here, like social psychology, where in social psychology that discipline alone has 15 different journals, and they've got the economic resources where there's like 15 to 20 articles per issue. In JHC, you've got 3 issues per year with 6 articles. So whereas the denominator is smaller, just the total numbers of articles that can be cited is so much smaller that it makes it really, really difficult to move the impact factor in counseling. So there's those 3 kind of main factors. So yes, we do our best to be attentive to it. Yes, we do our best because it does matter to our authors. Like if you get cited in a journal, I'm sorry, if you get published in a journal with a high citation or impact factor, it does matter. And so I'm attentive to it for those reasons, but it's not something that's easily malleable.
Thank you for the answer.
I hope this is helpful. I'm certainly going to stick around. Are there any other questions or thoughts or Lindsay, other things maybe in some of the past sessions that I've talked about that kind of left on the table?
I feel like we kind of covered it, especially when you talked about like tips for junior faculty and doc students. Those are the kind of things that come up a lot. You really hit, I think, kind of a lot of what usually comes up.
Hopefully I'm consistent across sessions. Well, I can stick around. I mean, if people want to ask individual questions or anything of that nature, but I greatly appreciate everyone's time, and I have have fun talking about these things, and I hope it bears fruit for folks, because it certainly does for me.
I would like to thank everyone who makes this happen. First of all, it's been really helpful for me because I mean, I studied in the US, I worked in the US, but it's been a while since I'm not able to follow JCD, or I'm not able to keep up with everything going on in the United States. So I think this was a really good opportunity for me to keep up with JCD, and especially for like sending submissions from Turkey. I know it's going to be different because when you collect data in the United States, you send it over and it's very relevant to the journal. But now that I will be collecting data in Turkey, I wasn't sure if it would be a fit for the journal. So I really appreciate your response.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that you're attending, and I do hope that you not only submit yourself, but you encourage colleagues who are doing relevant work, to submit as well, because it does improve and expand our perspective.
Yes. And my second question, that ranking system is pretty much like probably specific to Turkey. In our tenure promotion things, we are collecting points to get our tenure. So in collecting our points, we are getting our points based on like the quartile rankings, the index of the journals and stuff. So that's why I asked that question. It wasn't something I was even aware of when I was back in the US, but it's something very emphasized here in Turkey.
It's not, I mean, unique to Turkey. I mean, there's certainly like a number of like East Asian countries have a similar system, and I think there's some value in it. There's not a lot of things about the American system that I think really, I was actually just talking with my brother-in-law about this morning, that there was an interesting article in like the New Yorker or some popular press magazine just about like, is academic publication, I don't think the word was fraud, but just similar theme. And I don't think that that's the case. I do think that, it's like any industry. You have a lot of things that are produced, and it takes those lot of things to produce for the few things to percolate to the top that actually make an impact. But that's not how these counting statistics work. Like it almost forces us to think that everything has to be at a certain level to be a contribution. And so I think it's kind of an artificial burden in some way on junior scholars especially, but then international scholars as well. And so, whereas the one nice thing about at many universities in the United States, and there are some who are more consistent with what you described there in Turkey, but because we rely so much on external reviewers to put context to it, that even if you publish in a journal that might not get indexed in the same way, if it fits within a person's perceived expertise area, it gets valued. And it's not just the numbers, like there's a qualitative aspect to it. And so I think that, I obviously have no authority to make those recommendations outside of, spaces like this, but I think that there's some value to that the numbers don't tell a great story here. So
I agree.
Yeah.
Hi, I guess I'll just take a moment to say hello. It's always weird, kind of. These Zoom meetings are so strange, and didn't know what to expect. I really just kind of wanted to come and hear a little bit more about what, I don't know, I guess anybody else would talk about and ask about. I am getting to a stage where I will start making submissions to journals. And so I don't have a whole lot to ask right now. I just really wanted to come and listen and learn.
No, I greatly appreciate that. And I probably would do the same thing if I were in a similar space. Where are you at? Just out of curiosity.
So I am almost done at the University of Georgia. Hi, I'm Regina Finan.
Hello, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Nice
So-
to meet y'all.
Who's your faculty advisor there? Just out of curiosity.
Dr. Annalise Singh.
Yeah. Wait, she's not there anymore.
She's not there anymore. No. So she, in her graciousness, agreed to stay with me while I finished up. So I will be finishing up this summer, and it's a super exciting time. So yeah, just I've got a lot of things at different stages in the pipeline, and working with her, I'm doing a manuscript style dissertation. So I'm going to have 3 to 4 publications possibly. And so I'll be trying to decide what to submit where, but my study, I will likely be submitting to JCD.
You have a good mentorship, and Lisa's a good friend and great scholar. So yeah.
Incredible mentorship. Absolutely. Yes.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, do reach out if you need any support. And yeah, thanks for attending.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so I know that there's a YouTube channel, and I haven't looked at that yet, but does that basically have different kinds of sessions like this that you've done?
Yeah. So I think if our collective memory is right, we would agree that this is our 3rd or 4th. And so we've had, I mean, the content is generally consistent across all of them, I think. So if you can endure a lot of the redundancy, then it might be valuable. But yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I can endure the redundancy. One of my strengths and something that I have to manage about myself, just in general, but certainly as a scholar, is I don't know if you're familiar with Clifton Strengths Finder. So similar to the whole Myers-Briggs thing, but basically the idea is that you have certain strengths. One of my strengths is input. So I love collecting stuff, and I happen to love collecting information. For some people, maybe it's $2 bills. I don't know. For me, it's information. So yes, I am constantly amassing great amounts of information and then doing deep dives into rabbit holes that can get a little redundant, but I love information. So yes, that would be great. I do have a question, but it's kind of more of a personal, personal question. If you're game for talking about it, I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey and how you got to this place in your career. And kind of like what sort of choices did you make?
Oh my goodness. No, it's great. It's great. How far back should I go on this? Let me think here. So I actually, I remember a time. So my primary interest is in school-based counseling.
Okay. Yeah.
So I actually there was a time when I almost jokingly in high school said that I wanted to be a school counselor, but it wasn't really something formal until towards the end of my undergraduate, when I was taking classes in what was then cognitive neuroscience program, but it really was more on the cognitive side, and taking graduate courses in education. I took a philosophy of education course where we read Vygotsky, Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and Dewey, and one other. And I thought, like, who could actually do this? Like, in a school. And I didn't come from a personal background where anyone went to college, nonetheless graduated, and no one, I didn't even know grad school was a thing.
Yeah.
And so as I was talking with my undergraduate mentors and advisors at the time, many of them were encouraging me to go in philosophy, doctoral programs, and which I considered. Also, I had, way before it was in vogue, since the time I was 15, so more than 30 years now, I've been a practicing meditator. And so I had these interests, but at the time, what was then neuroscience and what was mindfulness were really, really edgy stuff, right? In the late 90s.
Yeah. Right. Who talked about that then?
That's right. And especially in schools.
Yeah.
Right. And so, for me, honestly, like if I were to go back, I probably, well, no, I don't know. I have a deep love for school counseling, so I probably would do the same thing, but I don't know if I'd have done it quite the same way. Um, but at the time, the idea of going into a neuroscience program and studying things that I didn't think we would, like human consciousness and how that intersects with like cultural diversity and issues of equity and justice, like who would have thought that that would be a thing? Or same
Right.
thing with mindfulness, like who would have thought that would be, that there'd be magazines and less academic journals? Like it wasn't a thing. So I thought, in school counseling, I could do that with uh, without calling it as such, right? You could talk about things like self-regulation and feelings of connectedness and solidarity and so on and so forth. So, and then I looked in the literature, like who was interested in similar things, and there weren't a lot of people, especially like earlier in this session, I was talking about just the paucity of intervention pieces in school count. So in counseling in general, it's 6%. In school counseling, it's less than 1%. It's actually 1/10 or 1/100. It's 1/10 of a percent of the published articles or intervention pieces in schools,
Yeah.
which is just next to none. And so really there's just one person who surfaced to the top. So I went down to Florida to study with him, and he's now like a father to me. And so, that was a good decision. And then, but it was, then I chose my doctoral program because I could do academic studies still in counselor ed, but there was a secondary program in neuroscience in the South Carolina College of Medicine, and that you could take classes in. So
Yeah.
I was able to do that. And but then I met Colette Dollar Hyde, and she made me an associate editor, first a reviewer, and then associate editor, then the Humanistic Journal. And I was once I became faculty, then within I think about 4 years, which is probably not the best thing, but it ended up working out kind of nice. But she stepped away from that journal, and I took over as assistant professor and of one of our division journals. And I did that for a number of years. I was a professor at University of New Mexico, loved it there. And when this came open, as much as I loved being an editor of the Humanistic Journal, like that's a truly niche market. Like there's this, it's cool pieces, great work coming out of there, but it just has a relatively small readership. Whereas I thought with JCD, there were things as a profession that I thought I could offer some contributions to. And so because we just have a broader readership, and so
Yeah.
applied to do this. And a lot of it has to do with those two ideas, that we just don't have a lot of top level encouragement, that we need more practice and outcome pieces. And then also the idea of diversity, justice, and diversity and social justice within our outcome pieces. And so, anyway, so that was kind of the Cliff Note version of the course.
Well, it's cool to hear kind of where you started and then the progression of everything. And then so sort of being pulled in by a mentor to be a reviewer.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing that like you develop a certain set of skills in that process.
Or the illusion of skills. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. That probably also really sort of helped refine your own work as a scholar.
That's right. Well, it's kind of like as a counselor, I think it's analogous to that. Like one of the best ways to become a better counselor is to be a client, right? And to watch and steal the techniques of others.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
like I definitely have learned more about being an effective scholar. Like I think even now, like when I'm working on projects with students, well, we haven't written anything together yet, Lindsay, but like I write very quickly now. And it's because I think in my mind, at least this is what I'm telling myself, it's that I read like I see the trends, I see the patterns. It's almost like an athlete when they, are older in their career, but still are playing at a high level. And they generally say it's because the game slows down for them.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the case for many people in academia as well. Like you see kind of the patterns and how things are published or what things you need to do to construct a study. I think like if I had to give a recommendation to, and I think I said this during our session, even if you don't have an interest in intervention pieces, and I get that they're a time suck and expensive and hard, and if people want to get their work known and funded, do counseling pieces, like do intervention pieces, like just don't, the preponderance of our literature being descriptive in nature, there's
Yeah.
again a place for that. But if you really want to stand out,
Yeah.
think about how those descriptive pieces can actually be made into something you would do as a practitioner and then bring it to scale. And it's not that my work has necessarily been the best, it's just that I've focused on intervention pieces and there's so little of those that it gets noticed.
Yeah.
And I also, again, I get all the reasons why we don't do many of them, but yeah, so.
But there are so many good reasons to do it.
Yeah.
Really good practical reasons. So no, that's great. That's a great tip. And I will certainly be putting that one down in my things to work towards. And I just want to say that I'm really encouraged to hear that, you know, sort of the focus is looking at outcome work, and then also that focus on equity and social justice. So I'm really, yes, I'm looking forward to doing some work in those areas. As I transition out of being a doc student and going into faculty position, I mean, it sounds like you were maybe indicating that your transition into journal life in a leadership role was kind of fast. Is that what you were kind of saying? Okay, yeah. So do you have like a maybe suggested sort of timeline? Like go ahead and get comfortable in your first year and focus on your research, and then maybe start looking at.
I think the first minute you have an opportunity to become a member of a review board, do it. And I think
Okay.
Yeah, and the first minute you have an opportunity to be a reviewer, especially the more, I don't want to say competitive, but the more prominent journals, do it. And not only for your career, like in terms of advancement, I mean, there's certainly that, like, you know, being on the right boards does help towards like tenure, for example. So there's something pragmatic. But again, I think there's something more internal as well. Like if you are just looking at this as a service opportunity, and I think that framing is probably true for most people, but I think that there's an alternative frame that is, I'm doing this to learn. And the best articles are coming to our top tier journals. I'm going to learn more, not always, because I mean, there's some real, every piece has got virtue, but there's some real questionable pieces sometimes, even at the top tier journals. But again, it's probabilities, and you're more likely going to see the pieces that are the kind of like bellwether pieces for our profession. If you're having to think about them and deconstruct them as a reviewer, that's going to make you start thinking about your own work differently.
Yeah.
And so, you know, that's why I say, you know, the best thing you can do as a scholar is to become a reviewer. And the best way to improve your experience as a reviewer is to do it in journals like JCD or CORE or CES, you know, like, and even some others outside of our discipline, like in a content specific area. So.
Okay. Well, that's really wonderful and helpful. And I appreciate your willingness to kind of talk to me a little bit about your professional journey. And though I know that wasn't really the purpose, I think, of this, but thank you for that. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. But I mean, I think it is helpful. It gives one example, because I do think it's relevant, right? It does give one example of a way to do things, and it's not necessarily the best or only example, but it is one example. So,
okay.
Well, it's a pleasure meeting you. Good luck in finishing up. And
thank you.
Yeah.
It's so nice to meet you all. Have a great weekend.
You too. Be well.
I posted the JCD YouTube link in the chat for you if you want to grab that before you go.
Thank you. I got it. Thanks. I
Welcome.
appreciate
Cool.
it. Y'all take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Lindsay.